Welcome, everyone. Good morning in the Pacific Standard Time, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us. My name is Hilda Fernandez, co-president of the Lacan Salon, founder member, and clinical director. Welcome, each of you, and our highly esteemed speaker today, Dr. Eve Watson. Before introducing her, I want to acknowledge that the Lacan Salon was born and meets regularly in Vancouver, Canada, which is located on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. I want to invite you to visit the Lacan Salon website to check the various activities we host. We are reading Seminar 12 in our ongoing Salon Tuesdays. We are having various activities also on alternate Tuesdays. These are free associative activities. For example, this coming Tuesday, Desiree Young will present a collection of video poems to discuss the relationship between writing and psychoanalysis. On May 7th, I will be talking on the radiance of object petit a. And in June 4th, Lee Tennant will be talking and guiding us on the question of the feminine becoming an ism. Also, we will have a series of conversations with Corpo Freudiano to explore some ideas about the possibilities of a psychoanalytic school to respond to the need for rigorous formation on Lacanian psychoanalysis in this region, and to alleviate the increasing demand for analysis of this school of thought in the city under the possibilities available with the government regulations. You can join these discussions. I encourage you to sign in for the listserv by writing to contact lacansalon@gmail.com to be informed of our various initiatives. Mandy Mansouri, the secretary of the Lacan Salon, is putting the links on the chat. To end the announcements, let me remind you that our current event with Eve Watson falls into our speaker series. You can see previous talks on the Lacan Salon YouTube channel: Danny Novus, Alireza Taheri, Leon Brenner, Dan Collins, just last week. All very enlightening talks, and you will have the chance to watch Eve's recorded talk as well. Now, it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Eve Watson, who lives and works in Dublin, Ireland. She has a psychoanalytic practice in Dublin City Centre and is an academic and writer. Her book with Dr. Noreen Giffney is Clinical Encounters in Sexuality, Psychoanalytic Practice, and Queer Theory, from Punctum Books, 2017. She has book chapters on the voice, melancholia, and the impact of the small screen on clinical practice, and has published on children and transgenderism, female sexuality, group psychology, and film. She's editing 2 book collections, one on the drive by Routledge and the other on Freud's case studies in contemporary context, Routledge as well, both due in 2024. She's the course director of the Freud Lacan Institute in Dublin, and in 2022, she was the Erikson Scholar-in-Residence at the Austen Riggs Centre in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Finally, to introduce Eve Watson, I just want to share a short anecdote of when I was in the Freud Museum in Vienna last fall, October 2023. I was visiting for about 5 hours, reading, walking the space, walking the history walk, right where all about psychoanalysis started. When I entered Freud's old apartment, which became Anna Freud's apartment, then later her consulting room, I saw an exhibition entitled Analysis Interminable. There are a series of high quality videos, wonderful interviews showing various schools of thoughts within psychoanalysis. Speakers from various school of thought rather were talking about object relationships, relational analysis, Laplacian analysis. And in the left corner of the space, of course, we have the Lacanian, and who's speaking there? No one else but Eve Watson, sharing enlightening insights about what is the difference of psychoanalysis from the Lacanian perspective. I felt very moved by her words and also by the wisdom she represented there for this perspective of psychoanalysis. Today, Eve will be delivering a talk entitled An Exegesis of the Case Study and its Significance in the Teaching and Transmission of Psychoanalysis. The case study was crucial to the development of the analytic thought and practice. It will walk us through the relevance of the clinical case in psychoanalytic praxis and for the importance for the transmission of psychoanalytic thought. Without further ado, let us hear Eve Watson now and help me to welcome her. Thank you, Eve.
Positive consequences of the pandemic, and this is perhaps one of them. So greetings from a very windy Atlantic stormy Dublin in the evening time on Saturday evening, and greetings to you wherever you're coming in from. Very interesting to hear about your work in Lacan Salon. Hilda, thank you very much for that. And hopefully my talk today on the case study will be of interest, and it will go in different places and have different aspects to it. So hopefully there'll be something for I suppose something for everybody in it. I'm going to read from the screen, which means I'm not going to be able to see you because I can't do that at the same time. So if there's an issue, Hilda, please just say it and call my attention to it. So I'm going to begin now, and as I said, I'm going to read.
Absolutely.
So the clinical case study reevaluated. I'm going to begin with an introduction, and I suppose begin with some general principles in respect of the case study. And much, I think, of what I say in the beginning will be well known to you, but nothing. It's a good way to situate ourselves, I suppose, and get going on this topic, which I've been thinking about for a number of years, actually. And I notice you're involved in thinking about training and education and the not often said the pedagogical side of the transmission of psychoanalysis, and the case study is heavily implicated in all of this. So I hope this will lead to some lively discussion and debate today. Now, Freud, of course, famously proposed that psychoanalysis is an impossible profession. And the case study, as John Forrester puts it, is a pedagogical and institutional attempt to make up for this. We can recall that psychoanalysis is an impossible profession for a number of different reasons. One, it cannot cure patients' symptomatic responses and solutions to suffering. Rather, it supports glimpses at better and perhaps more livable responses and solutions which patients may or may not take up. Two, the practice of psychoanalysis requires its teaching and transmission. And education is famously the second of the three impossible professions. Number three, psychoanalysis, education, and politics, or governance, the third impossible profession, are impossible because they cannot make good the lack inherent to the sexual rapport. That is, the fundamental alterity that makes complete union between beings possible. There is always a gap, a crucial, productive, desiring gap, but an unbridgeable gap nonetheless. Of the three professions, psychoanalysis, at least Lacanian psychoanalysis, does not promise, as Lacan specifies in the ethics seminar, to fill that gap with ideals of love, ideals of complementarity in relationships, of authenticity. He actually mentions authenticity, which you hear about a lot today, authentic this and authentic that, of authenticity, of satisfactory and complete object union, or worse, happiness. Rather, it makes the non-existent sexual rapport the basis of an impossible relationality, or in Freudian terms, and as Katrine Liebrecht puts it, an ethics grounded in the Freudian imperative, wo es war, soll ich werden. And I translate there, this is one translation, where the ego was, the id will come to be. Now, Lacan takes this a little bit further, and I quote him here, and this is a fairly well-known quote from the Function and Field of Speech. What is realized, and this is a quote from Lacan, what is realized in my history is neither the past definite as what was, since it is no more, or even the present perfect as what has been in what I am, but the future anterior as what I will have been, given what I am in the process of becoming. This ethic is therefore grounded in a movement of becoming, and it obliges psychoanalytic acts, ACTS, on the part of the psychoanalyst, which include imposing the rule of free association, interpretations, interventions, cuts, and so forth. This impossible ethic and its practice must be transmitted, taught, imparted, and this is done usually by theoretical exposition and studies of case and clinical work, often by authorized bodies and groups. And of course, what is fundamental is one's own personal analysis is also fundamental to the transmission of this ethic. So to continue this notion of psychoanalysis as an impossible discipline, this discipline with impossibility as a central tenet is therefore transmitted in and by groups in which typically education and governance play a role. And in fact, some of us, for our trouble, are involved in all three, and sometimes at once. As Freud himself wrote in Analysis Terminable and Interminable, in psychoanalysis, along with education and government, quote, one can be sure beforehand of achieving unsatisfactory results, end quote. Central to all of this, and I suggest carrying this trifecta of impossibilities, is the case study, which places the case study in a privileged position in psychoanalytic teaching. So let's talk about the case study, having established the ground that psychoanalysis is an impossible profession. A case or a clinical study typically demonstrates how theory is applied to practice, the unfolding of the analyst-analysand relationship, the psychoanalytic process, in effect, what transpires in an analysis. It is the application of the theory within or to a clinical setting. And for me, and I'm supposing for many here, case studies offer and have offered a precious and vital window into psychoanalytic clinical practice. Yet, since the beginning of psychoanalysis, the case study has been problematic, and there is very little agreement on how a case should be presented. Case presentations are therefore as varied and diverse as groups themselves, with oral and written presentations, analysts presenting patient cases, supervisors presenting supervisees' patient cases, and there's the pass. But let's go back to the beginning and begin with Freud's own. As well as the 6 major case studies and the studies in hysteria, Freud's prolific writings are filled with rich and fascinating vignettes, cases, and clinical accounts that deepen and enrich his theoretical expositions. But they are extraordinarily different and diverse. And one thing we can say about them is they lack any kind of uniformity. His longest case, Dora, is, according to its title, but a fragment of an analysis of a case of hysteria. The Rat Man is a whopping 104 pages long, and is referred to as Notes upon a Case. The Wolfman begins with Freud disclaiming the following, quote, "I've abstained from writing a complete history of his illness, of his treatment, and of his recovery, because I recognized that such a task was technically impractical and socially impermissible." End quote. In summary, Freud gave lengthy accounts of 3 patients, calling one a fragment, a second notes, and limiting the third to unraveling an infantile neurosis, while telling us that it was technically impractical and socially unacceptable to give a complete history. There is the case of Schreber, whom Freud never met, but analysed via his published memoir, and little Hans, who was the son of a colleague and whom Freud met only once. And there are the studies in hysteria which are important in their own right, none the least because they demonstrate Freud's approach to case presentation at an early stage in the development of his psychoanalysis. And we can, in reading the studies in hysteria, see that his approach is already informed by partiality, synopsis, problematics of revelation and concealment, questionable didactical usage, and certainly in the studies in hysteria, the as yet unidentified problem of transference. So a case then is typically not an accurate representation of what actually happened or what was said, but is in fact a reproduction of what occurred, and it is subjective. It is subjective because the clinician selects from an analysis or from a session or a series of sessions and represents it, either verbally or in written form, sometimes in a prearranged format, as in a length of time, if it's presented verbally, or a particular word count or number of pages if it's in written form. So these are outside contingencies that determine how the case can be presented, and that will have a determining effect on the selection. Not the only things, but certainly in part. There may also be legally imposed and self-imposed limits applied to what can and cannot be said. And I'm referring here to confidentiality and so on. And in some cases, patient consent. So again, there's no such thing as a complete case history that would or could capture everything that transpires in an analysis. We've all been there. Well, I'm presuming we've all been there. So I've certainly been there. When a case presenter actually tries to capture everything or most of everything that's said or transpires, and it is very boring and tedious, and the listener is left wanting to hear the key points. What are the key points? What are the key moments? Freud warned about this in his last major case study in 1920, the case of the young homosexual woman, and I'm going to quote him here. He says, quote, "Linear presentation is not a very adequate means of presenting complicated mental processes going on in different layers of the mind." End quote. And this is picking up on a very similar sentiment in an earlier, much earlier letter to Jung in 1908, where he simply wrote, quote, "A real complete case cannot be narrated, but only described." End quote. And of course, importantly, there's no such thing as just case content. There is the analysan's personal history, the way they attend to their story, the use of certain phrases and words, and there's always the relationship between the analyst and the analysand. And this includes both the transference and the analyst's transference, and sometimes institutional imperatives. Or as Ian Parker describes it in an article I'm going to refer to later on, the culture of an institution informing how a case can be presented. The problematic on one level in Lacanian terms, can be described as the non-relation between the analysand and the analyst, insofar as there is no coincidence between them, no meeting of the minds, no unanimity of understanding possible. Some maybe, but no unanimity of understanding possible. There are two subjects interacting via speech, coming from different and highly subjective positions, who nonetheless find a way to address each other via speech and to make room for the new and the creative in the space preferred by this non-relation. We can add in here further problematics, such as whether a case is ongoing or whether it has concluded, and institutional considerations such as whether an analyst's future career is on the line in presenting their case. As Ian Parker, the aforementioned Ian Parker, notes in a 2018 article, which I highly recommend, in Lacune, entitled Psychoanalytic Case Presentations, The Case Against. He says there that cases tend to be, quote, and I've already referred to this, saturated with elements of the psychoanalytic culture in which they were formulated, end quote, and can end up being standardized and offer a single perspective of a progress of a case that meets with institutional criteria and does not, in fact, explore the meandering, messy nature of the treatment. Forrester helpfully reminds us that psychoanalytic case presentation and writing in this context is exemplary of a failure insofar as it ends up symptomatizing what it is attempting to do. It is a betrayal of the confidentiality of the setting, and in invoking a third party as partner or spectator, it ends up perversely betraying the founding condition of psychoanalysis. But then he quite rightly asks, is there any human practice for which it is impossible to bear witness and impossible to transmit without betrayal? Much of the tonality, pacing, temporality, surprising elements, and impactful silences of the treatment are lost or arguably cannot be captured when it is represented. At least we can say that unlike other disciplines, psychoanalysis does not pretend to objectivity, at least in terms of an objective, factual presentation of a treatment. We factor in the fact that there are no human relations without transference. And in order to transmit something of the work, this subjective transferential element is both necessary and expected. Freud insists, and I'm going to refer here to both of Freud's technical papers from what are generally referred to as the technical papers, Observations on Transference Love and the Dynamics of Transference, both very important papers. And actually challenging papers in their own right, deserving thoughtful, careful readings. And he says there that for the analyst, the only serious difficulties he has to meet lie in the management of the transference. It's a very, very clear statement there. And that she or he must manage what is tantamount to a love relation. And he refers to it as transference love, which is inmixed with the infantile and the phantasmatic. That is the transference, is inmixed with the infantile and the phantasmatic. Not mixing his words, Freud characterizes this as, quote, a struggle between the doctor and the patient, between intellect and drive life, between understanding and seeking to act, and is played out almost exclusively in the phenomena of transference. And he continues, the psychoanalyst knows that he is working with, and I'm quoting him directly again, the psychoanalyst knows that he's working with highly explosive forces and that he needs to proceed with as much caution and conscientiousness as a chemist. end quote. Now, moderating this and transmitting this into a writing or into a written or an oral presentation is, to say the least, not easy. In fact, it's very difficult. And for those of us that have done this and that have ventured to do this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's very difficult. And we could say that in doing so, the analyst is placing herself on the line. And I will come back to this again, certainly a little bit later. Ian Parker again, and taking a critical approach, suggests that something essential is lost in this transformation of one speech into another. That is the Analysan's speech into a case presentation, in the synthesization of hours and hours of discourse and effective flow into a clinical narrative, in which key points are indicated as insight or trauma or in a signifier, and in seeking to capture the counterintuitive temporal logic of the clinic when things shift, when the symptoms begin to speak, when there is a cure, when the subject of the enunciation is enabled. There is what he calls a peculiar dialectic of construction and deconstruction, in which the analyst constructs and reconstructs what they think is happening in order to direct the treatment. And this occurs within a frame in which the Analysan's truth is not transparent in direct speech, but rather is found in error, omission, ellipsis, and sometimes even in fiction. And I will return, and I'm actually going to finish the paper today with some reflections on dialectic later on. So I'm just going to leave that aside for now. I'm going to return now to some of the elements of an analytic treatment. How is the pacing, Hilda? Is this pacing okay? It's okay?
It's wonderful. It's
okay.
Going really well.
Okay, good, good.
Thanks.
The treatment is directed by the analyst in listening attentively to the ebb and flow of full and empty speech, by enabling the subject to speak within an enunciative process in which truth momentarily appears and disappears. Challenges arise, as we know, because the important things are the most difficult to speak about. And there is a constant interplay between rationality and irrationality. A successful treatment, to call it that, is indicated in moments of insight and a different, perhaps even a transformative restructuring of the relationship to ideals and to others, produced out of these gaps and irredeemable contradictions between conscious and unconscious, between analyst and analysand, between said and saying. And I suppose I'm referring here to the subject of the statement as distinct to the subject of the enunciation. These gaps are the driving arc of the treatment and maintain, often frustratingly and unsatisfyingly, that at the level of certainly for the analysand, that at the level of a simpatico of understanding, there is in fact none between analysand and analyst. There is such an abiding loneliness that attends to the singular suffering of each analysand in the organization of jouissance and in the symptomatic management of their desire. Can we give this fair and accurate representation? I'm reminded, and I will digress from time to time into the anecdote, which I hope will be of interest. This is one of them. I'm reminded of my colleague, Olga Cox-Cameron here in Dublin, who spoke recently of happening upon an audio recording of a session conducted by Wilfred Bion. With great excitement, she listened to it, only to be bored to within an inch of her life by the size, coughing, silences, and generally slow movement of the session to the outside listener, who of course knows nothing of the work that has come before. And of course, the recording device does not while it captures sound, does not capture presence or movement. So every account we give of a session or a case betrays on several levels its promise of confidentiality, the tenor of the work, and the elusive nature of full speech, and the hugely significant qualities of the transference, which are rooted in repetition, in the infantile, in infantile attachment and fixation, and in fantasy. So, are there then forms of writing and representation that can inscribe the very difficulties raised here of the fact that we work to facilitate the truth being spoken, even though the truth is by definition what slips away and is alienated within language? The truth, as Lacan puts it, can only be half said. Can fiction reflect the reality this is referring to? We should, as Ian Parker argues, take seriously the structure of fiction in the clinical case study in order to build in incompleteness and gaps. This, he argues, limits a kind of monovision that can arise in a discursive elaboration that is molded according to a particular psychoanalytic tradition. And whether we like it or not, as Lacanians, we are molded in a particular, and by the culture of our group, in a particular psychoanalytic tradition. The idea of the use of fiction, you could say, is already built into Freud's own use of the early cases, the studies in hysteria. I'm going to say a little bit about this now. The studies in hysteria are undoubtedly informed by Freud's experiences at the Salpêtrière in Paris, with Charcot, where I suggest Freud is brought around to the idea of preferring to the reader a veritable ringside seat into the mind of the patient and the work of the doctor. An important clue is given to us in Freud's own review of his process of writing the case studies, these being the studies in hysteria. The cases, he writes, and this is in the discussion section of Elizabeth von R., read like, quote, short stories. Now, the German word that he actually used was novella, and Strachey's translation, where am I here? It does not quite do justice to what this encompasses. Novella in German is similar to its English definition. It invokes a narrative form of writing, typically prosaic, and it is a format usually reserved for fiction. The cases stand out both for their individuality and their differences to each other, and each one is an engaging read in their style and approach, as is typical of a novella. In this, the reader is not allowed to settle into an easy or relaxed state as effort is required to follow along, as Freud is documenting his evolving method. That is the movement from Breuer's cathartic method to that of free association as the principal psychoanalytic method. All of this makes it difficult to simply voyeuristically enjoy the studies, because as novellas, the reader is witness to an unfolding story as well as an evolving method. And this idea of a work continually in progress characterizes all of the subsequent case studies. Dora, Little Hans, Schreber, the Rat Man, the Wolf Man, the Young Homosexual Woman. Cases to which Freud returned to time and again, applying flexible definitions and indicating in each a general lack of unity. I defy anyone to suggest that there is a unity in reading the Dora case, for example. This is, but you could say it about all of them, and particularly the cases of Dora and certainly the Wolfman as well. Their fragmentary rather than comprehensive nature give the impression of a burgeoning science and of a writer's journey that was constantly in a state of renewal and at times wonderment. Let's take the Dora case. There Freud begins the prefatory remarks, as he titles it, by restating the impossibility of a case study to completely elucidate a case, and how the psychoanalyst is caught between a duty to transmit case material and to protect the patient from discovery. He goes on to describe 3 kinds of incompleteness of the case study. First, as with an archaeologist, the analyst is only able to go as far as an excavation has revealed. Secondly, it is not an interpretation that is to be considered, but the results of an interpretation. And thirdly, finally, no single case study can provide the answers to all of the questions at stake. Patrick Mahoney, who has written extensively on several of Freud's case studies, including Dora and the Ratman, observes that Freud's style, and I'm quoting Mahoney here, remains perennially fresh, more lively and engaging than many subsequent psychoanalytic treatises, end quote. And he argues that Freud's discourse combines a style that involves a way of writing about psychoanalysis, which he describes as exploratory writing, where he writes in order to discover what he is thinking and to share it with the reader, as well as containing findings he dogmatically supports and sometimes later disavows. Mahoney calls this a combination of, the one hand, a genetic or historical style, which includes Freud's unconscious and is reflective of the psychoanalytic process, and on the other hand, a dogmatic style to which he ascribes 5 characteristics, which he draws from Freud himself in An Outline of Psychoanalysis and in his concluding lectures in Analysis. His dogmatic style aims to expound rather than convince. Its procedure is deductive, as it begins by stating his conclusions, and the procedure makes demands on the reader's attention. The tenets are presented in the most compressed form, and the reader gains an impression of a self-contained whole, W-H-O-L-E. By contrast, Freud's genetic discourse is an expository process, where he is educating the reader, developing their self-awareness, following an investigative path which builds upon psychoanalytic ideas already propounded, not just to persuade the reader, but in order to encourage associations and reenactions, not just of the readers, but also the writers. And Freud includes a sense of an ongoing exploratory process which encourages and facilitates the reader's associative and critical faculties. As he does, for example, and very well, I think, in his discussion with his lay listener, where he engages with a person who is skeptical of psychoanalysis. It's a really interesting device to do that. So this combination of historical and dogmatic styles, this is Mahoney's analysis of Freud's style in Dora, is quintessentially Freud's own, borrowed in part from Charcot. And in fact, it inflects most of his writing, especially the case studies, and it puts the reader to work, engaging them at different levels, and we could say in different registers in the Lacanian sense. There is the imaginary register of completeness, as in, aha, I have it, I know what the case is about. There is the symbolic register, in which the significant and granular aspects of the case are open to consideration and testing in relation to theory and concepts, and where there's a working through an interpretation of the text. The effect of the register of the real is to refer to something beyond the text, which can't be reached, but is nonetheless vitally important. Freud thus does not allow for passive spectatorship, and as we all know, neither does Lacan. His convoluted oral style is arguably, aiming at all three registers as well. Adding to the use of the narrative device, Freud introduced, and some of you may already have thought of this, the importance of constructions in analysis in his famous 1937 paper. Here in this late work, he proposes, or rather reminds us, that a work of construction is necessary in organizing the material of repressions which emerge piecemeal in memories, dreams, which are invaluable in themselves, but seriously distorted by the dream work and that of ego censorship. The Wolfman and the Wolfman's Dream is a prime example of this. Repressed experiences, he continues, and I'm going to quote him here from Constructions, are, quote, derivatives of the suppressed affective impulses, as well as the reactions against them, end quote. And the repetitions of affect and action performed by the patient, both inside and outside the clinic room, must be made out from traces, all of which are driven by the transference relation. The work of construction is that of reconstruction, particularly of the patient's forgotten early history. And as he notes, the timing of delivering a construction is crucial, as is the patient's affirmation or rejection of it. A construction is not based on historical truth, but on a reconstruction of it. And it is not necessarily a verifiable truth. Indeed, and to underscore this, that the constructions are not necessarily verifiable truths, Freud indicates that delusions are on the same continuum as constructions and operate similarly as attempts at explanation and cure, although for delusions, there can be little more than a mere fragment of historical truth. How then to represent such a process of construction in a case presentation and to show its precise timing, and whether the consequences are affirmation or rejection, and whether those represent denial, acceptance, displacement, or refusal. Parker again is highly critical of reducing the truth of psychoanalytic practice to factual statements, which he argues would move the status of speaking from the enunciative, and what he, I think, very usefully describes as a processive process, facilitated by the analytic discourse, to a fixed status of speaking that relays it to an external audience, where it is molded by another trap structured by discourses of mastery and the reifying university descriptions of the world. And he, like Forrester, speaks of betrayal in this, a betrayal and a replacement of the truth spoken by the subject of the enunciation with an image of the subject as the subject of the statement. And this would be the subject of the analyst's statement. I'm reminded here, and I'm going to introduce another anecdote here. I'm reminded here of several recent experiences in teaching that may help to illustrate aspects of the points raised here. I was recently working with a group of psychotherapy, not psychoanalytic trainees, who were very interested in learning about psychoanalysis, and in particular, how it differs clinically from humanistic or relational approaches to therapy. In discussing this together, they suggested to me a role play of an analytic session in which one of them would be the patient and I'd be the analyst. And we do a simulation which would facilitate an insight into how an analysis works. While I was aware that this is how they are obliged to learn about clinical practice on their program, I was so taken aback by this request, I was momentarily rendered speechless. How to refuse this request and explain it without denigrating their established way of learning? On regaining my composure, I said, I could not possibly produce the locational, temporal, and transferential specificity of an analytic session. And I also said, and I wouldn't be good at that. The group, in fairness, knew enough about transference to accept this. And instead, I have agreed to listen to a case presentation and offer some analytic points of commentary about it. It's actually happening next weekend, so I can't tell you any more about it than that. But maybe some thoughts about this request and this way of thinking about clinical work and the presentation of a case. I suggest that what seems to be at work here and in psychotherapy generally is a fantasy of simulation, which is based on the idea of transparent speech, with no apparent difference between the flow of speech and its enunciation in the clinic room and its reproduction later. There is a conflation of the reality of the clinic room with that of the classroom, which is a very strange approach indeed, certainly from our vantage point. It seems to be premised on the existence of a rapport between speech and language, and between speech and the subject, whereby the subject is represented not allusively and elliptically by one signifier to another, but objectively by the signifier. And oversight of these simulations is because they're witnessed by the class group, typically, and which puts pressure on the client to perform and the therapist to correctly interpret. And such a masterly approach absolves itself of the moral dilemmas about the rights of confidentiality and the ethics of representation, because it's not a real case, is the thinking. I'm just going to, I haven't written this in, but I'm going to digress. I'm working with a different group, and I've suggested them to work with one of Susie Orbach's published cases. And I told them that Susie, and you may know this, but that Susie Orbach has come out and said that all of her cases are made up. They're fictional. I don't know if you'd heard that. And what was interesting to me was the group, and this is again these are not psychoanalytic trainees, they're psychotherapy trainees, but it's useful to think about what they offer us. They were outraged that Orbach published made up cases as they saw it, and felt cheated in some way of proper case material. And that's very interesting, and led to a very interesting discussion and a very useful discussion that we all had about what case material is, but that again, that expectation that that all of these moral dilemmas and ethical dilemmas can be bypassed by some, like Orbach, who will publish a true and proper case, but that a role play is necessary in the classroom to deal with these in some other kind of way. But as I said, it was a very interesting discussion with the group, and they were really up for it, I have to say. So I suppose while I will try to transmit something of the crucial role of limit, gap, elision, the unsayable, and the precarity of the analyst to this group, I suppose I'm not that optimistic. I'm struck by the contrast with a Lacanian clinical group I recently engaged with. And I hope they won't mind if I say here their ethos as they stated it to me in offering me an invitation to join them. So this is their ethos that they sent to me, this group. Quote, "This workshop," it's a clinical workshop, "relies on an oral transmission and dynamic discussion and dynamic discussions based on the clinical material brought by participants to the group. We must not miss the impossible, the unsayable, and thus must face the ultimate emptiness of signification. Working with the unconscious, we rely on some kind of knowing of unknowingness. How does it sound like when an analysand speaks? How do we experience the precarious position of the analyst? The format is based on open presentations of clinical material, open questions, theoretical texts we read and discuss together, and the exploration of weaving theory and clinic. A study of contrasts, to be sure. And here the emphasis is on the multiple voices of the group, not simply those of the case presenter and the discussant. The group is not an observing, critical one, satisfying any moralizing tendencies and voyeuristic jouissances of its members, like the classroom observing a simulation. Rather, it is an active, multi-voiced community working case material over together, not for the sake of agreement, but in order to provoke discussion and debate. And the emphasis is on the analysand's discourse, not on the analyst's. Or at least by that I mean what the analyst has to say about it. This is an oral and open presentation of clinical experience. And my experience of this Lacanian clinical group was its embrace and instrumentalization of the very lessons Freud imparted. The fragmentary nature of clinical representation, the importance of the unsaid, the challenges of thinking theory in relation to practice, the absolute singularity of each case, and the unconscious manifestations of the transference. What else can we consider when it comes to transmitting something of clinical practice? A practice that takes the real of impossibility and inarticulatability into account. So different then to oral presentations, we could say, is the writing of case materials. We cannot say they are the same. And some would argue that the writing up of case material introduces a sterility to case material and a further distancing and so on. Well, it depends on how it is written. For those of us who have ventured to do this, we know how challenging it is to select from the treatment and transmit in written form the sayings of the analytic process. And it's perhaps best not to try that. There's a quote from Stephen King from his text on writing, which I highly recommend, by the way, that goes, "The hours we spend talking about writing is time we don't spend actually doing it." And we could substitute treatment for writing here. So the hours we spend talking about treatment is hours we're not spending actually doing it. The treatment and the writing of it are worlds apart. And that's okay. And we do well to draw on various psychoanalytic, literary, and artistic devices to support the representing of clinical material. Similar to how Freud drew on the notion of the novella to present a case. No more than we could ever do justice to our own analysis in attempting to represent it. We cannot represent a case without altering it, without inserting ourselves into it. And you may recall moments when perhaps you've tried to capture a particularly important moment of your own analysis and convey it to someone else. And it's impossible. It never captures particularly if it's an element of surprise or something of the new that enters. It can't capture the jouissance effect of that. I mean, as soon as, of course, you try to put it into words, that's lost. That's the whole point. But it never fails to be disappointing. So we can draw on that experience that I imagine I've certainly had it, and I imagine others have too, when it comes to thinking about how to represent case material. Thomas Ogden offers psychoanalytic clinic, and this is an interesting paper he has entitled On Writing. He offers psychoanalytic clinical writing as the conjunction of an interpretation and a work of art, and argues that the reality of an analytic experience does not come in words, no more than one can capture the aroma of coffee or the taste of chocolate in words. He argues that the writing up of work with a patient is the creation of a new literary experience. It is the coming together of conscious and unconscious processes in the creation of fiction. It is, and this is Ogden, the imaginative rendering of an experience in words. The imaginative rendering of an experience in words. And the writer is changed and continues to be changed by it. The writer cannot say what an experience was. They can only say what it was like. The writer, in effect, ponders a case, gazes upon it, and is inspired to make a representation of it. So with that in mind, I'd like to go back to Ian Parker's proposal that we take seriously the structure of fiction in making clinical work available. The effectiveness of a case is premised not on its truthful or factual verity, but rather its pedagogical effect, if there is to be one, lies in its conveyance of significant moments and interventions to the reader. The fact that we read so extensively, and I'm going to juxtaposition this point with what I've just said, quite deliberately as a point of contradiction. The fact that we read so extensively, for example, around Freud's major case studies, and read, for example, of Freud's strange personal relationship with the Wolfman, of a completely different case from a biographical perspective of Sidonie or Margaret Sonska Trautnegg. Yes, that is the name of the young homosexual girl whose biography is now published. It's a completely different case from her perspective. By doing this work, we accept a case study is only ever partial and incomplete, including Freud's own. Freud emphasizes this, you could say, by going back to Dora some 20 years later, nach Träglichkeit, when he realized, to his enormous credit, that he'd been quite wrong in interpreting the transference, and this had disastrous consequences for the case. This indicates there can be a certain incompleteness in case formulation, and sometimes questions remain about the analyst's transference to the case material. Sometimes it's as if a case is not finished with the analyst. I'm not necessarily suggesting that we produce works of fiction in presenting cases, but that a little bit of fiction can go a long way. The use of devices like the novella, as Freud did, builds in the impossibilities of case representation, but with the effect of making the reader go to work, not necessarily knowing where it's going. This may be especially relevant for Lacanian psychoanalysts because reproducing the text of the treatment with an emphasis on signifiers can be difficult to do for confidentiality reasons, and is probably why we don't see many clinical cases in the Lacanian field published. We don't really see many cases published, do we? I think we can acknowledge that. And that's, I suggest, because in order to do that, it requires tending very carefully to the text, and it would make it difficult to disguise it, and there would be questions about how to do that. And I think, I don't know what you think about this, but psychoanalysts in other traditions get around this by focusing a lot on the countertransference in publishing cases in other psychoanalytic traditions. One area that interests me is the use of film as a model of clinical pedagogical transmission, and I think I included that in the description of the talk today. And one of the reasons it interests me is that over the years, I've found this to be a very useful mode of conveying psychoanalytic clinical concepts, ideas, and queries in an open discursive way. I mean, there's nothing like getting a room going and by showing them a clip, a cinematic clip, a television clip, in ways that I find reading a case, it doesn't seem to do it in quite the same way. And I'd like to explore, if I may, with you, why and how this could be included, along with the devices of fiction and novella-type writing, as a mode of the transmission of both theory and practice. Perhaps the first thing we can say is that film is attractive, or at least a certain type of film is attractive, because of the suggestion of an unknown or psychological element at work beneath the surface. An Irish analyst, Noreen Giffney, in an interesting book she published a couple of years ago, I have the book here, it is, no, that's not it. It's a different blue covered book. I'll have the name of it in a moment, or I can include it in the chat thread. She has formulated, and she doesn't come from the Lacanian tradition, but she's formulated the idea of the cultural encounter case study method. The cultural encounter case study method, which is an experiential offers an experiential and teaching aspect to learning about psychoanalytic concepts. In this approach, participants are introduced to and are encouraged to engage with a cultural object, and in an exploratory, collaborative, interactive, and creative way. Reflection about the object is facilitated, and these non-clinical artifacts are treated in clinical or case study fashion. Now, Noreen draws from the Kleinian tradition to argue for the use of non-clinical case studies and draws from television, film, sculpture, drawing, paintings, installations, art performances, poems, plays, sounds, and music. And I'd like to expressly focus on cinema and the use of the screened story and argue for its inclusion in clinical and pedagogical transmission. And on what basis might I be able to do that? I'd like to suggest that Lacan's concept of the gaze is crucial to this, and it's a useful concept in considering what cinema and television actually makes visible, what it screens and what it actualizes. First, some thoughts about the gaze. It's the business of being looked at. It is passively experienced and it produces anxiety and disturbance. As Lacan puts it in Seminar 11, I'm looked at, that is to say, I am a picture. In this seminar, in his seminar the previous year on anxiety, he specifies the I as a mirror that organizes the world into space. It's not a mirror of the world. In its apparently, and I'm quoting Cormac Gallagher here, it's not a mirror of the world in its apparently natural relationship to an already out there real world. What is visually perceived doesn't reflect the world, but rather organizes a spatial relationship to the world on behalf of the subject. What is determinative of this is a look, the gaze, which is outside, anonymous, and non-specular. Paintings go some way to capturing this. They tend to have a vanishing point in their representational space where all the parallels seem to meet and make a hole in the surface. And this enables the picture, within the limits of the frame, to refer to the infinity and continuity of space. There's always an absence, a hole in a picture, which is correlative to a blind spot in vision. And it is where Holbein famously puts the anamorphosis in the famous painting explored by Lacan, The Ambassadors, as this anamorphosis, a strange, deformed object. In order to be able to see, the viewer has to be able to put themselves into the picture frame. And in doing this, the spectator will not be able to see the other objects in the picture. The visual field is divided between being able to see the anamorphic skull and the rest of the painting. Now, in cinematic terms, we could say this is eminent in the plug hole, in the famous shower scene in Psycho, in the planet Solaris, in the film of the same name, in the ground chasm that opens up in 2016's A Monster Calls, in the darkness of Buffalo Bill's cavern in The Silence of the Lambs, perhaps in the red coat of the little girl in Schindler's List. The result of being looked at in this way is the subject or the viewer is unmoored and loses their place. Symbolic and imaginary supports fall away, and the subject and the spectator, the spectator is in the picture. And this disturbance is also a clinical phenomenon. And the most well-known of this is the instance of the disturbing gaze of the wolves in the Wolfman's Dream. The real, the order of the impossible, is included in the gaze. And why would we want to include the order of the impossible, which often disrupts narrative capture and phantasmatic assurance? It unsettles identity and makes us feel anxious and ashamed sometimes. Because this is a real knowledge, an extimate knowledge, which is a knowledge that is intimately foreign or externalized otherness, and it is the basis of the new, the transformative. So to properly specify the Lacanian gaze is to restore the imbrication of unconscious and unknown processes in spectatorship as well as points in a text, be it that of the Anneliese speech or the filmic text, in which moments in which narrative coherence is broken and something else is rendered, such that the Anneliese or spectator is unmoored. It is the moment in which the subject is in the picture and they can no longer see themselves. The disappearance of the subject in the moment of the look adds to this and enlarges the gaze in analyses of speech, text, and image. And it is the dimension eminent in the encounter with the praying mantis, which Lacan describes in the seminar on anxiety as, I don't know what object I am to the other. Will I be the object devoured by them, or will I find a way to go on? At the end of the day, aren't the most interesting films and cases the ones that give a glimpse of a dimension behind the mirror, behind the obvious, one that is at once uncannily homely and radically alien? There's a reason the alien burst forth at the dinner table, the most ordinary of activities. It is what lurks and cannot be apprehended imaginarily or even symbolically. It simply is, outside of form, looking and waiting, into which we can project anything or everything. It makes us very anxious and can even make us go mad. It is the wolfman's wolves. It's the deadly gaze apprehended by the young homosexual woman in her moment of abandonment by the older woman. It's Oedipus's own eyes looking at him. It's the planet Solaris. These are privileged moments that break through the visual field, staining it. And this is not the usual activity of spectating as in gazing upon. It's the moment the other looks and we become unmoored, destabilized, nakedly exposed to another reality that doesn't reflect or offer mediation of drive reality. It simply pulses. From whence? creativity and the surprising may be possible. Well, this is a bit idealistic perhaps, but isn't a little of that necessary for the transmission of something or other? So to bring us back to the case study, whether it is a clinical case or a non-clinical one, its success or otherwise can be judged in the manner of its effect on the reader or listener or viewer, and whether or not they are put to work. One way of doing this is to one aspect of this is to consider the role of dialectics in this process. I mentioned earlier that I would come back to dialectics. I want to spend a little time on that now, on dialectics and on dialecticization.
And we have about 15 more minutes, Eve.
I think
17?
I think that's what it will be, 10 to 15 more minutes, if that's
Wonderful.
Okay with everybody.
Absolutely.
Can we
absolutely.
hang in there for a bit longer?
Yes. Oh, you recording this meeting locally? Yes. You are asking me? Yeah. It says if Watson is requesting to record this meeting locally.
Ah, there, I think I needed to hit OK. There we
Yeah.
go. Is that better?
Okay.
Good. I told you I couldn't see something else on the screen other than the text when I was looking at it. It was right there. Didn't see it. Okay. There is a dialecticism that underpins almost every aspect of Lacan's conceptual development. With Freud's works, he chooses to engage with them as one would in a dialectic, which has the effect of delaying understanding, intellectualization, and premature interpretation. It requires the reader to focus on what is said and to actually go to work. That is, to engage in a certain working through of the texts. The mental gymnastics required to work through Lacan's seminars and writing is not for the faint of heart, and works best for those who appreciate an approach to the subject as non-unitary, split, elliptical to discourse, and exemplified in a speaking subject who is subverted by conscious discourse. The effort involved in working through a text is one that mirrors, we could say, the representational dialectics of the Analysan's discourse. From problems with translation to the immense background reading of Freud and others required to undertake a reading of one of Lacan's texts, to the meandering abstruse style of his conceptual development, to his acknowledgement of other people's work and sometimes not, to the lack of clarity as to what register he's speaking about, and last but not least, the topological schema which appear and reappear in different guises in different places, all giving the impression of something still being worked out. The supposed self-composed unitary reader fades before the intriguing obscurity of these texts and is left wanting. I think Bill Richardson describes this, and he was referring specifically to figure out the subversion of the subject, that text, the subversion of subject, as putting out to sea in a fog. Whatever knowledge we had going into the text, it will be properly obscured as we go through it. To approach desire dialectically is also to instrumentalize a discursive method, which, of course, in analysis is the patient's discourse. This technique rests on approaching desire not as being in what is lacking in the subject field of not being in, but in is what is lacking to the subject's field of knowledge. Not in the subject's knowledge, but what is lacking in the subject's field of knowledge. The work of analysis supports the analysand in coming to recognize the otherness of their desire, and in so doing, to reframe their question through which desire is posed from what do I want to que voi, what do you want of me? Some dialectical maneuvering on the part of both the analyst and the analysand are essential to supporting this, given that desire is conveyed metonymically. It is the effective discourse passing through the signifier and is rooted in symbolic castration and the opposition between signifier and signified. And the analyst as such does well to have some immersion in a dialectical method. And let's consider how the application of a dialectical approach to casework is to be encouraged. We can take the lead from Lacan, who mentions dialectics tirelessly throughout his works. There's the dialectics of desire, the imaginary dialectic, the dialectic of transference, the Oedipal dialectic, the dialectic of demand, the dialectic of love, and so on. Let's take this comment from Lacan in this respect, and this is actually from Seminar 1, very early on. I'm going to read you this quote. Psychoanalysis is a dialectic. What Montaigne in Book 3, Chapter 8 calls the art of conversation. The art of conversation of Socrates in the Meno is to teach the slave to give his own speech its true meaning, and it is the same in Hegel. And he goes on, the analyst must not fail to recognize what I call the dimension of the dimension of ignorance's power to the dimension of being, and must guide the subject not to knowledge, but to a dialectical operation to show the subject speaks poorly, which is to speak without knowing. Still in Seminar 1. Now, what is this? This is a practiced ignorance, you could say, an ignorantia docta, which Lacan himself refers to, a position in which the analyst bears witness to the analysand's revelations and remembrances, the material of the session, in which the content of the analysand's verbalizations vacillates between the imaginary, real, and symbolic registers, and between truth and falsehood. It's the opposite of a position of mastery. Let's very, very briefly take dream interpretation. A dream, as everybody knows here, is a rebus, with each element potentially referring to multiple significations which must be associated to in order to extract the set of meanings that it is referring to. In this, free association is a relating by associative speech to the dream element that produces experienced subjective moments in which speech produces something new or surprising. The psychoanalyst engages in this dialectical operation in the knowledge that the law of association is an effort of thought that goes beyond conscious discourse to give speech its true meaning. But that meaning is never complete or finite. This is dialectical in that it involves working with contradiction, not to resolve it, but to put it to use. And such a dialectical approach asserts overcoming and preserving something at once, and involves repudiating the notion of whole, W-H-O-L-E, as a culmination of a dynamic progression or movement, and importantly, it does not aim at self-mastery. And it is maybe important to say that at this point, Lacan diverges, I suppose, strictly from the dialectical method, properly speaking. The position of the analyst is that of one who remains on the alert for speech that goes beyond the analysand, beyond what the analysand is saying and meaning, not to get to a mythical point of understanding, or as Hegel would have it, absolute knowledge, but at the very limits of understanding, at nonsense. In addition, the analysand must in the end be willing to submit to the idea that the other does not have the answer, and in coming up with one themselves, to make do with a formulation, maybe a construction, that manages the drive and its enjoyment. Such a formulation, a writing, a signifier, a myth, a construction, a story, is a synthesis that carries that traumatic unsayable. Lacan's dialectical term seems to be profoundly captured in Freud's formulation mentioned earlier, wo es war, soll ich werden, where the ego was, the id will have been. This is perhaps better captured by Bill Richardson in his translation of Lacan's restatement of it from the position of the unconscious. This is really something. This is his translation of Lacan's restatement of Freud's wo es war, soll ich werden. Quote, there where it was just now, just where it was for a while, between an extinction that is still glowing and a birth that is retarded, I can come into being and yet disappear from what I say. Well, if that doesn't put you to work, I don't know what will. Where is all this going? The thing about presenting cases, and I'm coming to a conclusion of a kind, I promise. The thing about presenting cases and what can make a difference is the openness of the audience and the case presenter to a dialectical method that includes the complex intentions of the presenter, who both wants to reveal and conceal aspects of the work, to be objective, to be both objective and subjective, to give it a serious stamp, even when it is more like a short story or a novella, to address a clinical question arising from the work, to make sense of the transference, to identify lacunae and elisions, perhaps even to transmit something new. By listening dialectically, the audience can look beyond the partial and supplementary nature of a case and engage with its imaginary, symbolic, and real aspects in ways that query, reframe, contradict, and perhaps reconceptualize a case. It's not easy to do and can be uncomfortable for the case presenter. At the end of the day, in presenting cases, analysts write about events and activities they themselves are directly involved in, something few other professions do. And while they rightfully make no apology for this, the imbrication of the subjective, performative, and transferential in case presentations benefits from the unknottings bestowed by dialecticization. And that's all I have to say.
Bravo. Thanks, Eve, for such an amazing talk, very nuanced, very broad in its sort of reach. I want to open the floor for whoever wants to pose a question. I have some questions as well, but also I want to let people speak. In the meantime, I can talk about what I was thinking. First, it reminds me, remember, Eve, when I presented a case in Lacan, Toronto? It was an APW kind of meeting in Toronto. And I presented a case. And
Yes.
then you whispered to me, you are very brave. Because it was really intense, the reactions of the group with regards to how the analysts put themselves in sort of in the line, as you put it, right? Like sort of with all these questions, and it's kind of very, very complex what you present about what gets transmitted in the transmission, what gets transmitted when we present clinical cases. And I was going into this thing that you sort of nuanced very nicely. What of the impossible get past? A little bit, like kind of what Lacan talk a little bit about the past, whether or not we want to do the past or not, but what get passed, what gets transmitted of that object A, or that impossibility when we are speaking about our activity, and that's what you propose as this dialectic. I think it's a dispositive, in a way, a device that allows yeah, sort of the not know to be sublated in a way, no? Talking about in a Hegelian way, no? Like sort of this yeah, towards certain knowledge of that impossible truth. And I also was thinking about couples therapy, the show that it sort of brings. I don't know if you have seen it, but it's sort of clinical sessions of couples, and I found it quite interesting for the richness, despite all the performative aspects. Right. But yeah, these were just kind of comments and thoughts that I had. I think Mandana has a question, and I'll keep an eye on who else wants to talk. So I'm going to pass to Mandana, please.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful and very inspiring. I was thinking while you're speaking and waiting for poetry to come into your like landscape of thinking about case presentation, but in a way at the end I was thinking like, you know, like one way is to think and to stick to the narrative of what happened, and the other way is to transmit the effect or the affect of the psychoanalytic kind of like treatment. And I was wondering if you could speak to that, to the relationship between poetry and the experience or the case presentation, if there is anything in that for you.
What a wonderful question, and I fear I'll be completely inadequate to answering it well. It's interesting, poetry. I mean, I immediately flashed to let me come at this askew by way of another anecdote. There was a recent article in the New York Times by an Irish writer who regularly contributes to the Irish Times, Una Mullally, where she talked about the special relationship between Ireland and the United States is now irreparably damaged because of world warring events. And she wrote a very interesting article about this very, very special relationship. The relationship is so special, we assign a part of Dublin Airport is actually part of the American territory, Homeland Security. It actually exists in the country, but that this had been irreparably damaged as a result of recent events. And the point I want to make is that she concluded the article with several lines from the Nobel laureate poet Seamus Heaney. And if you may or may not agree at all with the sentiments of the article, but it's actually, it was a brilliant work to conclude the article, not just with some words of poetry, to your point, Mandana. I think to your point, which maybe we'll explore a little bit now. But I mean, there's the particular choice of words that she uses from Heaney about it's a pity I don't have it to hand. I'll look it up momentarily, but it's about the coalescence of moment and history. It's very, very powerful, and it is more powerful than anything that she has said up to that point. I defy anyone to read those lines and not be moved by them in some kind of way. So poetry is, and the later Lacan, did talk about the importance of the poetastic aspects of the analyst, and I suppose working, with the speech of the analyse and working with it in ways that facilitate it, ways that thinking of it as conveying and operating in ways that poetry can. I mean, that's an extraordinary way to approach the speech of the analyse and I think it's a very important point that you make, and can be added into, maybe if we would like to call this sequence of devices to support how we refer to casework. Perhaps we could look at ways of conveying casework in not just in a more prosaic way, which is what I referred to using the novella and fiction, but perhaps in a more poetic way. And what would that be like to convey something of clinical practice in a more poetic way? Well, maybe the later and the very later Lacan, the more obscure Lacan, is pointing to that in some kind of way. Maybe that's a model that we can borrow from. And maybe others of you have some ideas about that. But I'm very glad that you mentioned that. Thank you. And I'm very glad that you mentioned sublation, Hilda, this important Aufhebung of this term of Hegel's, introducing this notion of a point of negativity, if you will, which is, I suppose, the position of the subject relative to discourse is a point of negativity. And that's also an excellent sort of grounding point for something poetic, is starting with nothing, with the nothing, with this point of negativity.
Right. And kind of touching something through the poetry of the real, isn't it? Yeah, and while people kind of prepare their questions, I just have a question, very brief for you, Eve, about the difference between a vignette and a clinical case. In my understanding, a vignette is just like a little kind of excerpt of a clinical situation in which you use, it can be a phrase, just to instantiate some of the concepts that you are trying to grapple, for example, both in writing or in oral transmission. And the clinical case as such that you were kind of presenting, kind of how that, for me, it kind of gives the opportunity of observing throughout certain kind of length of time how the transformations, the dialectic transformation, the dialectic reversals might occur. And I wanted to ask you if you think the vignette kind of should also follow a little bit of this dialectic approach, or is something that is only, like a little bit of a placeholder in a, speech or in an argument. What is your feeling about that?
Yes, I didn't really address that at all in my presentation today. And of course, the difference that you specify is absolutely spot on, the difference between a vignette and a case. I love vignettes. I really do. I think they're often more useful than cases, case formulations. And I think a great deal can be done with the vignette. Now, maybe something more than a line would, in that case that I'm referring to, but that, some of the best writers in our field that use vignettes, I think do so very effectively. I'm thinking of Geneviève Morel and Patricia Garavici, Darian Leader, Bruce Fink. They deploy this very well, and I suppose the film clip, the cinematic clip, fits into that category of vignette in that kind of way, and absolutely is well served by a process of dialecticization, and provided that it offers that, I mean, that was kind of the point I was making. You can take a clip from Transformers, the film. That's probably not going to do very much, although Callum Neal was trying to persuade me that superhero films were worth analyzing there recently, and I'm not convinced, but maybe somebody else can do that. But once there, it's not, as I think I suggested in my presentation there, that once there are holes in the text, HOLES and you know what the text is effectively doing. It can be very short, as in a vignette, and just give a fragment, a very, very small fragment. But then again, what is a vignette and what is a case of Dora's? As long as it is, and it is but a fragment. You know, again, you know, these are important discussions and debates I think we benefit from having, and maybe we should have a few more of them.
For sure. Thank you, Eve. Desiree?
Hi, Eve. Thank you so much. Your presentation was like a blast of sunshine for me anyway. It really opened a lot of things to think about. And I have one question and a comment. How, like if you can, how would you think if the desire of the analyst who listens to the case is the same desire as the one that writes the case? That's one question. And the other thing that I was thinking, because, you know, I find that you know, I'm a writer and I went to creative writing schools. And one of the things that is very, very forcefully taught in these programs, these very popular MFA programs, is that you can teach writing. And at the same time, they say, well, but it's impossible to teach writing. So even though writing is not considered an impossible profession, it is taught as it is one, even though they give you some sort of guidelines too. So I guess the other comment that I wanted to make is that perhaps, you know, autobiography and autofiction, like works like Elena Ferrante, which are very popular precisely, I think, in my opinion, because we don't know first if she exists, if she's a woman, who she is, and also because it's supposedly, is it her life? Is it not? So there's always something that is fragmented, that people want to know, and there is that relationship with the text. And like, for example, the other writer that came to mind is Karl Ove. I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but he's the Swedish writer who wrote 6 volumes on his life. And it's really about nothing but his life, and you can't stop reading. Anyway, I guess my question, it would be, how much of the desire of the person that is listening is the same one as the one that sits to write the case. Thank you so much. It was a beautiful presentation.
Thank you, Desiree. Well, I suppose it depends on what that desire is. I mean, if it's why do we read cases? Why do we look at vignettes? Why do we do this? I mean, how many of us are here? 32. There are probably 32 different reasons at any given time why we do that. And it may be for the aha moment, for that sense of, oh, if I ever heard an Anneliese say that, that is one way of responding to it. It could be for that. It could be to, to develop some kind of deepen our theoretical knowledge and know more. So I'm sort of working my way through the imaginary and symbolic registers here. Or maybe it's to be, without knowing, to be transported into something completely unexpected, and so on. So there are different ways in which our desire, as we enter into reading something of clinical practice, informs that reading. And whether that matches with the desire of the writer, I mean, it would be hard to say, but we can maybe generalize about that. If we go in a kind of open dialectical way into a text, it probably meets with what Freud was attempting to do in terms of provoking the reader to not settle into some kind of complacent, voyeuristic ringside seat. He never, ever lets you do that. And that's what I find really interesting, and inspiring. Why we go back to there is a danger in going back to the case studies then and reifying them, that this is exactly how you always deal with obsessional neurosis. This is how you deal with hysteria. This is how you deal with psychosis and so on, and we must not do that. But I think in the very writing of the cases, they are, you know, it's and I'm working on a publication at the moment about Freud's case studies in contemporary context to try to think about Freud's major case studies, but also the studies in hysteria, as operating as, you know, how they avoid falling into the trap of reification, because we've all read, haven't we, those case studies published in other areas, in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis and so on, and they are dead cases. I mean, they don't inspire. They're often very well written. You know, it's an exposition that reflects very well, I would suggest, on the writer and on the work. There's a progression that can be mapped, beginning, middle, and end of the case. In some cases, if it's a little bit more than a vignette. Or there's, as I said, you find a lot of work done on the countertransference. In fact, I just finished reviewing a paper on the countertransference, and my response was, it would have been so lovely to hear about, you know, what were the sayings, what was the text of the patient that led to this countertransferential response on the part. Like, I can't judge it. You have to take it as given. I think Ian Parker describes it as you know, sometimes you have to read it as a kind of telepathy that happens between this counter transferential reaction in the analyst that's somehow then going on to have an impact on the work. In most cases, it's not said. So it's the liveliness and the openness of Freud's cases, and Lacan as well, when he does talk about clinical work, and it is always by vignette, I would suggest, really, Lacan's, except for I suppose the case of Aimé, you know, that is a very, very interesting exemplar, and I'm very interested in his use of. And I sort of, is it a call to dialecticization? This is Lacan, you know, throughout his work. We do well to pay attention to this. And I was also struck by just, you know, again, moving away from the written text. I mean, there is a difference between an oral presentation of a case, you know, which in many ways is richer, I think, than a written presentation. Again, it depends on the writing. Sometimes written cases can be absolutely wonderful, but the effect of you know, the screen, and the you know, what is it about certain screened things that are so effective in getting a group engaged with a psychoanalytic concept? So that was the question behind that.
Great. If we have another question by Eric in the chat.
Yeah, I can read too. I was just curious, you know, I don't know if it's just something that came to mind, I guess, but you were talking about different materials that you might use to convey a case or to represent something in the case. And I was thinking about working with children, you know, how they produce drawings that can be reproduced also in case write-ups, and also, you know, this kind of like a making of sounds, even, that feels like it happens far more often in work with kids anyway, you know, where I find myself in consultation or something too, you know, like explaining what was going on and how the sound that the child makes, trying to reproduce this kind of funny sound, let's say, right, and how the child speaks about it. And I don't know, I just was curious if that's what you thought about that in terms of this presentation of a case too. I found the use of film to also be fascinating. It makes me want to go watch movies to see how they, you know, how they convey something and trying to think about in cases. A wonderful presentation in general too. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Yes, you're absolutely right about the importance of the process of symbolization for children is a bit different, and they would often use drawings or sand work and all kinds of ways of doing that. in terms of the representation of sound, what immediately came to mind is Finnegan's Wake, the Joycean text, Finnegan's Wake. You cannot read that without reading it out loud and doing it through sound and tone. There's no way to get to any kind of meaning without making your way through the sound effects of, what seems to be an incomprehensible collection of words in any particular sentence in the entirety, I would say, of Finnegan's Wake. And there's something very provocative about Joyce's use of word that, how does Joyce do it? How does he manage to get sound into word? He does it through the use of nonsense. Now, to some of you, that may be poetic, actually, that process in and of itself. And there's a few people here, I suspect, who are quite versed in Joyce and might have maybe something to add to that. So that's what I think of Eric. Thank you very much for your observation. Shari.
Yeah, hi, fantastic, great. And so grateful to Zoom, because that's how I first heard you, through après coup. That was my first time hearing you, and then able to go to fly events and hear Dan Collins, and Dan Collins led me to Hilda. And so it's just sort of, yes, Zoom. But I was thinking that when Mandana asked her, for me, very important question about poetry, that for sure you were going to start talking about Joyce. That's where my mind went. And what I think is so resonant in Joyce, and maybe not all poetry, but the way in which so much poetry points to sense and nonsense, sense and horse sense, what's out of sense. And in some sense, no pun intended, that's precisely why conventional ideas about case presentations are so problematic, right? Because it's always looking to make sense and advance an argument and present, a clear logic. So, and also, Eric, I was thinking as you were asking about children, speech and sing-song, and like that can also be true of any body one is working with at any age, certain sounds, certain kinds of things that are very difficult to convey in a carefully formulated, whatever that means, case. So I don't have any particular questions. I'm just sitting here appreciating the range, the way you kind of took us through so many different questions about case, and I think of case and cause also, and sort of, it opens up into objet A, which is, so kind of challenging to articulate in any kind of, again, systematic presentation. And I'm also feeling, as I listen to you, that really vignettes or little pieces or little phrases, or maybe even writing a piece of poetry, right, can convey more, about full of identifications, or certain kinds of remainders, or it just, your talk just opened up lots of different or deepened, ways in which I have long since saw the case, presentation as problematic, including the demands of, institutional demands, stuff all these different things you were covering. So you've deepened my appreciation for the challenge, right, of case presentations, but also, like, I feel invigorated, I want to say, by what can be inventive in case or vignette presentations. Inventive, even in the moment, you talked about an oral presentation of the case, and maybe even something that's impromptu or improvised or not necessarily figured out in advance. There's just, because there's so much about the work that's ephemeral, impossible to pin down, fleeting, you know, in some ways always on the move. At one point in your presentation today, Eve, I think I heard you say something like, you know, if you, maybe these are not your words, but if you can nail it down, you think you have it, then you already don't have it, right? There's something about, you know, which makes me think of that opening to the preface to Seminar 11, you know, like, how do you communicate, how do you convey, you know, the space of the lapsus or the lapsus or the, again, what falls outside of sense. So just great appreciation, you know, from start to end, you know, of your presentation. And I would love to hear you say more about Joyce. Thankfully, I got to attend parts of, you know, Joyce conferences that Fly put on, and, you know, the importance of hearing it read and the sound. Where you also, you know, homologies and homonyms and just certain ways in which language is played with, right, in or opens up in the speech of a patient, and the ability to, you know, for the analyst to kind of, maybe it's because I have Seminar 20 on my mind and the function of the written, the ability to kind of to read what is heard, you know, and there's something about the resonances that are in language, in an unfolding speech that feel very like the impossible to pin down. So I guess the other thing I want to kind of also pick up on is what you said at different points in your presentation, that Freud's case presentations, you know, you said at one point, I dare you to find like a single, maybe that's not it, in the Dora case, that this is it. You know, it's like he's moving around, you know, he's like, it's opening as he goes, you know, and he lets there be contradictions, you know, he lets, you know, his own back and forth stand, which in so many case presentations at institutions, that's like unthinkable, you know? So I don't know, I just really, really appreciate the presentation, and I just, big thank you, and thank you to everyone here in Lacan Salon and other people's comments. But I wonder how this piece you're working on right now about case presentations will unfold, you know, in your own, you know, even what you get from working with two different kinds of groups, right? Psychotherapy.
It's wonderful. Yeah.
And you're about to do it next.
Why do you do this? This is right, because there's so much to be learned, and to think there isn't is hubristic. I don't understand that. I've learned more from this psychotherapy group of trainees, I think, in the last year than I have from other groups. So I think it's very, very important that we remain in touch and in discourse with other disciplines and other, you know, I think it's very, very important. But just to by way of just saying something very, very quickly about Joyce, Shari, one of the other wonderful benefits for me, and there were lots of negative things as well, I can tell you, but one of the wonderful benefits about the pandemic and Zooming was we had a Zooming the Wake reading group. And we used to meet every week for an hour and a quarter. And we managed to get through a paragraph of Finnegan's Wake, one paragraph, all going well in the hour and a quarter. But we nearly always began with, and we had a wonderful moderator of the group, with a piece of music. To your point, because of course Joyce used, I mean, it's over 100 pieces of music are used, I think, in Ulysses, if you were to tabulate them all up, and there are many, many more. And he loved music. He was a very, very good singer, wanted to be a singer, Joyce. But that, you know, he's obliquely referring, it seems to be, to a piece of music. So we would begin often with you know, what, and it was often one of these teeny older versions, you know, dating to 1925 or something like that. But it was such a lovely way to begin, then making the way into the text, and I suppose highlighting, you know, what is outside of the signified, to begin to go in a way that is outside like that. I think was very valuable.
When you bring up music, it makes me also think, you know, it's not this sort of single line. It's not linear, right? I think somewhere, or maybe many places, Lacan will talk about staves of music, right? And what one listens for, how one engages, like, so to bring in music is, I love it. Great, thank you.
Great. Thanks for this kind of wonderful riff about poetry and kind of musicality. I have another kind of note to read from the kind of chat by Natalie Saluk. She's quoting from Ernest Young's book on, I think, on the practice of psychoanalysis or something she put here in the chat. She says, "It is noteworthy that the anal erotic complex plays a part in relationship to each of the 5 arts: architecture, sculpture, painting, music, and poetry, as might have been expected from the important contribution to aesthetics in general that is provided by the reaction formation against anal erotism." Until then, the quote. And Natalie says, "Made me think not only about sounds children make, as well as flatulence, for instance." And yeah, it's kind of interesting because, yeah, I have a case in which flatulence in the session was like almost like the presence of object A. That was a very important point of working through a certain regression in a case, that it was just called upon right there and sort of work it through that. But I don't know what you have to say about that, about other musicality.
Well, I immediately thought of coughing, which plays a part in at least 2 cases I can think of immediately, and hiccuping as well, which you may be reading about at some point in the not too distant future if you're in any way interested. But so those are, you know, again, two other, but they're you know, the cracking of joints, you know, the various sounds that and also smell, I would add as well, which, you know, if we weren't aware of it, again, when we moved to the online work, you know, it reminded, I mean, I think that's, again, one of the benefits of moving back to in-person work, is that if we needed to be reminded of how presence manifests, you know, it does also in smell, in odor, and as well, and how that can be translated into how that can be represented, and I use the word translation there, that there's something lost in moving from, and it would be, and that's the difference, I think, with a Lacanian case presentation often that you see, and presentations from other traditions, is what's extracted are the enunciative aspects of the case, typically, which are, you know, very interesting, as opposed to, you know, I think that's why other cases are not very interesting. But even in the extraction of that and the representing of it, something is irredeemably lost. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, and we shouldn't be frightened of doing it. And it was not my aim at all this evening or this morning, or as it is for yourselves, to say we shouldn't do this or we should be frightened of it. It was, I think, if anything, to encourage us to do more of it, and to bravely take it on, like you did, Hilda. There is an element of bravery involved in presenting case material, because we do put ourselves on the line, and what unconscious elements are in in what we're presenting that we have not recognized, because it often takes the other to recognize those,
Absolutely.
no matter how experienced we are, and so on and so forth. But that they are so important, vignettes and case studies. It's as a praxis, and we would benefit from having more of it, and we can all do it, and including myself, we can do more of it.
That's wonderful. If I have one more question that I think is very important, just the last one to grapple. This is by Felix Nilan. In the beginning of the presentation, you were discussing the impossibility of the sexual rapport in relationship to the psychoanalytic relationship, and the risk of trying to fill the gap or void by striving for love, authenticity, or happiness. Even though those terms are not necessarily used in the theoretical literature, I feel like they are unconsciously part of many analysts' ethical approach. What are your thoughts on this? This no sexual rapport with regards to love, authenticity, or happiness.
I'm not reading it now, I'm listening to Hilda. Is the writer saying that in fact some analysts are pursuing those as you know, that they're working from the position that those can be garnered in the analysis, that you know, that working to the rapport, or to the notion of rapport as opposed to non-rapport? Is that what the...
Maybe, yeah. I mean, Felix, you can speak for yourself. Maybe
I don't want to.
Yeah, no. But I read it in that way as well, right? Like some analysts approach by sort of love, authenticity, maybe happiness. Is that, Felix? You can text me here if you want.
Well, I think certainly Anneliese arrive with those expectations of you know, and you hear that, and you know, looking for more authentic ways of living, more authentic ways of loving, happy. Of course, these are goals. Of why wouldn't they be? But we don't make them the cornerstone of what we do, and it's precisely because we don't that all of these other things are possible. That would be to close up the essential ellipse or lacuna out of which something transformative. I mean I mean it's such a contradictory notion that out of the structural negativity that is the subject. The subject is represented by one signifier to another. That out of the working, you know, to an ethic of the sexual non-rapport, that it is not possible for there to be a one-to-one complementarity between two beings, that so much is possible. It sounds like a contradiction, and it is difficult to explain that to others outside of the field often. But Anneliese often arrive with the expectation that rapport is possible. It's not up to us to convince them otherwise, but to direct the treatment so that they are perhaps less wedded to that, and particularly if that is causing them to suffer. I don't know if that in any way answers Felix's question, and my apologies if it doesn't.
I think that's it. Help me to thank Eve with a applause. Thank you so much, Eve, for this wonderful talk, and it's going to be on the YouTube channel very soon, and I hope you have a wonderful time. Thanks for joining us, and keep in touch. Yeah.
Thank you, Hilda. Thank you, Lacan Salon. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Eve.